Nice. All right. Can someone jump on the Hangouts link now that I have it started and see if we have a working setup here? Don't get windowception doing it. Does anybody have a computer? From the Facebook event, there's a link to the Hangouts event. I just want to make sure that it's working for the people who are not here. So it's on a delay. Okay. All right. I don't think there's much I can do about that. Terrible. Don't go to the Hangouts link. All right. So try to, actually one thing I just realized, try to say something in there. Either ask a question in the chat, I guess, somebody. Oh, that'll work live. It's, I guess it doesn't show. Okay, I get it. This is the first time I've ever used this.
Try Zoom.
A Zoom?
Zoom.us is so much better.
Oh, is it?
25 people for 40 minutes for free, 24 hours a day.
Well, I'm going to be going 2 hours though, and this is this.
$10 a month, unlimited 24 hours a day, 25 people.
Well, that's cool, but you guys will have to shell out some nickels for me to pay that $10 I can't afford. I'm kidding, but this is free and the class is free, so we'll stick with this one. But I will check it out later. I appreciate it. All right. So we'll do it this way and quickly switch away before we get windowception. All right. Cool. So let's get started. I have no idea. Do we have anybody else on the Hangout or not? I keep forgetting not to look at that. So my goal for this is to start from a blank canvas everybody, I know other people who have taken like Code Academy classes and stuff like that. So let's, to get a start, a feel for where people are, what is everyone's experiences? Who's a computer science major? Nobody, okay. That's good because you might be, well, it might be a little bit too slow for a computer science major. What else, what is everybody else doing? Business or something like that? Or yeah, business, okay. All right, computer engineering, okay. So are you more hardware focused then? Okay. Yeah, definitely. So for those who are who already have a programming background, you'll have to be patient because we're going to walk real slow. The assumption of this class is actually that you have zero computer programming experience whatsoever. So we're going to talk about a number of computer programming concepts, and we're going to show how they would naturally show up as I'm trying to build out an application that has some non-trivial complexity. So you can get on the internet and really easily find tutorials about how to make something that's a Hello World app, or there's a thing out there called To-Do MVC, which is the idea of a little app that shows how to make a to-do app where you check a box and to-dos disappear or appear, and you mark them complete and stuff like that. And they write it in like 500 different programming languages because why not? So it'll be a little bit more like that. Maybe not quite that complex actually, but anyway, the idea is to introduce especially JavaScript and Angular. So HTML and CSS are also skill sets that we're going to utilize, but I'm not going to necessarily, I'm going to allow them to be a little bit more sort of mysterious and magical as to how they work. I'll show you how stuff works, and we'll talk about stuff, but at the same time, I'm not necessarily going to dive as deep because with HTML and CSS, generally speaking, it's more a matter of sort of memorizing what a bunch of different things do. But with JavaScript, you're actually dealing with a programming language that's capable of extreme complexity, and the sort of things nested inside of things, which can become very confusing for somebody who doesn't have a programming background, can be a lot more intense there. So that's why we're gonna, kind of focus on JavaScript. So my idea for my app is I have a I'm a nerd, as are most developers, and I basically am thinking, okay, I want to create a sort of database. It's not really a database. We're not going to use an actual database because we're not going to touch back-end programming, and that is part of that domain. But at a high level, it's like I have a set of rules that I want to display on a page, and they are part of a rule, like a role-playing game rule set that I created, right? So has anybody ever heard of Dungeons and Dragons, right? So one person, two people, yeah. Anyway, I play a lot of Dungeons and Dragons, and so I made my own rule set similar to what Dungeons and Dragons would be. And so what I want to do is I want to create an interactive list whereby I can pull data and I can search for those rules, search on those rules. Because one of the big problems with role-playing games, at least what we call tabletop role-playing games, where you have like a book that you look at for the rules, is there's a lot of proprietary stuff around it, and then the result is they never want anybody to go beyond just publishing the physical book. So then you have to go to the table of contents, and it's like, don't we live in the 21st century? So anyway, the idea is we want to make an app that allows you to search for rules and search for things within a certain data set. So the first thing that I'm going to do, so this is my app right now. It has nothing in it whatsoever. So start off, we're going to create this is my code editor. I like to use Sublime Text. If anybody else has other preferences, that's cool. If not, you can go to sublimetext.com, and you can download this for free. There's a version for all the major operating systems, including Windows, Linux, and Mac OS. So if you want to play the home game or practice at home, I recommend that because it's free, and it's also powerful, and I use it every day, all day, and I do pretty complex tasks with it. So that being said, the idea is that I want to start off with an HTML page, right? So the first thing I'm going to do is I created this file, right? So if I go to my Finder and I go into here, I'm just going to create this file locally. So the idea is normally when you look at a web page, you're looking at something that's served to your browser from another computer, actually, which is a server. Is everybody familiar with the concept of a server? Probably not. So a server is the idea of there are certain programming things that happen behind the scenes that process the programming language. So you have Java, you have JavaScript, you have PHP, you have Ruby, you have all kinds of different back-end frameworks that will serve. So if you want to have a website that's on the internet, you need to do that with a server. Okay, I'm going to try not to rabbit trail on things. That's not always true, but almost always true. But in any case, you can also browse files locally. Like if you have an HTML file downloaded on your computer, then you can browse that file locally in your browser. So right now, what we're looking at is my local file system, and I have this thing called, let's see, where is it at? Rules Generator app. Where'd it go? rules search app, right? So I have rules search app, and if I double click here, then I'm just going to get that in my browser. So right now it's got nothing, but if I take and I just say, you know, let's make an HTML document, there's a lot of magic that just happened. That's one of the nice things about what I call an IDE, which is like a program, a coding program. I can add some content here where we just say, let's see, weird. Can I zoom in? Yes, sure, good call. Good? Not enough? We're gonna have to zoom out at some point because we're gonna get a lot of code here, but for now, we'll stick with it. So the first step, we're gonna just print to the screen, hello world. So we're gonna make sure that really exists. Okay, so this is on my local computer, and I now have I have a web application. No, I have a website now. They get a little bit more complex than this. Title tag, we'll call it rules search app. That means when I go over here, notice that it now shows right here in the browser tab. So that's the title attribute and in my HTML document. So the first thing that I want to do is I want to pull in, and let me check something real quick. Yeah, okay, good call. Yes.
I know I'm up there late, but is there any way that you can go on the internet for Sublime Text? Or is it open?
Yeah, you can just search for Sublime. It's actually sublimetext.com. So you can grab that. And I'm glad you interrupted me. One thing that I want to one thing I want to highlight, because it's different than how a class like this might normally be taught. My hope is that you guys will chime in with questions when something's not clear. Okay, so we're gonna there's no stupid questions. Some of these things we're gonna cover, I'll just sort of throw out there and explain in 10 seconds. And I may or may not have spent 50 hours trying to understand it at some point in the past, right? You know, so don't feel bad. I'm happy to explain everything, and that's the goal. So I want to assume that nobody has any programming experience, and you know, we're here to shed light on that as much as I can. You know, so is everybody clear so far on that note? Does anybody have questions yet? There's not much there, is there?
Now, I'm trying to think of a way to quickly get the text for people who want to follow along. Open Google Doc and just kind of paste in there.
What text? What do you mean?
Well, I mean, if somebody's gonna try to follow you while you're coding.
Okay, so my goal is not to have, okay, so let me jump back from that 1 second. I think that if we actually enter the code ourselves, it'll be a little bit even slower than I want. So I'm gonna code, but when you see magic that appears on the screen that doesn't make any sense whatsoever, stop me and we'll talk about what that means.
Are you gonna paste all the code eventually?
There's a GitHub repo that's public that you can walk through. So let's take a look at that. I think that that's a great, just a reminder of something that I just should have mentioned and didn't. So our whole thing, and so you can check out all of this like on the record, because we are on Google Hangouts right now. So you can look at the video after if you need to review this. And now this is permanently etched in the world's database of information. But this is where you can go to find what we're going to do. If you click on commits here, you're going to see, you can jump ahead and cheat and see where we're going to go, you know, for today. I'm assuming that since we're talking about assumption that people have no programming language, we're not going to get super far in this first session, and I've just kind of sketched out something which probably will take us 2 or 3 sessions to get to the end of what I have in there, I think, if not longer. So HTML is a series of, let's talk real quick about HTML. Different units, what we call tags or markup tags, have different purpose in the document, right? So we have HTML is the most essential one. That defines it as an HTML page. That allows the browser to interpret it so that it can understand, you know, what is the meaning of the text. Like the only way that hello world actually appears on my screen here is because it knows what HTML, the browser can interpret HTML, it can interpret the body tag, and it can interpret the H1 tag, which is just heading 1, right? All these tags, they have an open and a close, and the only difference between them is they have the same brackets, but you'll notice that this one has a trailing slash. So that's how you close and everything is based on this kind of nesting, right? So if I'm missing this, actually, interestingly, it'll probably still work. Yes, it still works. And the reason it works is because different browsers handle that differently. So like Google Chrome, for example, which is my browser of choice, Google Chrome intelligently will close tags that are not closed properly. But if I viewed this in Internet Explorer 6, then Hello World would not appear on my screen. So this is a required thing, right? So this is the most essential thing about HTML. You want to close your tags, you want to open your tags, and then you need to close them the same way you opened them, except with a trailing slash in front of it. So that being said, let's move a little bit forward now. Okay, that's still in there, that's good. So if you're not familiar, I recommend checking out Angular website for it. Okay. So what we're going to work with tonight, so I'm going to skip a little bit of the, I want to show something that's meaningful, right? So we could spend a lot of time on HTML and CSS, but as I told somebody else who had asked before, I want to focus on producing something that is meaningful, even if we don't understand every single thing about, HTML and CSS in the interim. Feel free to ask questions if something happens on the screen that doesn't make sense. But in the meantime, what I want to jump to is a web framework called AngularJS. So AngularJS is a great framework for building what we call rich client-side websites or web applications. What that means is normally we talked before about the server. So you have this idea of a server in the background that lives in a data center somewhere out there. And then whenever you visit a certain URL, you get files and HTML comes to you from your browser from that server. That's how a server works. So with Angular, we have an interesting thing, which is that a lot of the work, normally a page would be rendered in some programming language like Ruby or or Java or JavaScript or PHP. And then that rendering would happen behind the scenes, and then you just get this sort of dump that looks like this, which is all HTML. And so Hello World would be in a database, and then it goes from a database into an HTML page, from an HTML page down the pipeline to your browser. Okay, so again, we're not going to cover that stuff. It's more complex, and this is focused on front-end web development. So I do a lot of that stuff as well. But it's not that's not the subject matter for this course, at least not unless we go really far, surprisingly, and I run out of material. Then we'll look at server-side Node.js or something like that. In any case, in the meantime, so AngularJS is a means by which I can take HTML content here. I can make this an Angular application. And what happens is that gives me all kinds of rich interactive functionality. Things like, let's pull up Angular UI. Has anybody ever heard of open source software? Okay, sweet. Most of the web is powered by open source software. Linux is the primary operating system for most servers. So everything that you browse, not everything, but most things that you browse the internet on every day operates on open source software. So in open source software, what's really cool is we have this tool called GitHub. And GitHub allows me to basically, it's not going to let me out. You guys don't need to see all my notifications about things that are happening on my, but anyway, let's do it this way. So GitHub is a place where programmers can collaborate on code. I'm mentioning these kind of things because these are what I consider like essential tools in your tool belt if you're in the web development world. I use GitHub every day, all day. It's like a core part of me doing my job. It allows me to store code in a way that intelligently determines what code I made, what changes I made to the code, and what changes any of you may have made to the code, right? So if I'm here and we have, where did it go? Oh, we lost it. Our rules search app. So if you were to go to this URL, which is a public thing, anybody can see it. You could, through some steps that I'm not going to cover right now, at least, you could contribute to my very boring blank project that has nothing in it. You could add your own code, and GitHub acts as a way to mediate between different developers. It has concepts of time, like it knows that you committed code at 8:45 p.m. and I committed code at 8:50, so it's going to assume or try to make a educated programmatic guess about the fact that mine's probably more correct than yours because it happened later. But there's more to it than that, because that wouldn't always be true. But anyway, my point is that Angular UI is a open source project, right? And there's also another one called Angular Material. So actually, I got sidetracked because I think of Angular UI only because I'm actually a contributor to sort of, large open source project in Angular UI. It has many sub projects, and I'm a contributor, partial owner of one of those, which is it's a fun time once you're at that level of comfort with this stuff. But Angular.material, or no, that's what I want. So what we're going to use for the purpose of this this course is Angular Material. So one of the things that I'm trying to do for you guys, and you won't know this necessarily until you make mistakes and you get out there and you do stuff, is I'm trying to introduce you to some technologies that are particularly effective, because all of the things that we're going to do could be done about 500 million different ways, right? But I'm going to take a look at what I consider to be the best practices and the best tools for the job, right? So Angular is a very, very hot skill set. If you're a good Angular developer, you can find a job in about 10 seconds. And that's why we're going to cover it. So it's a good place to start as, hey, if you know this, you don't need to know all the useless things that I used to do before this great, better option came along, right? So you like that. So let's take a look at some of the demos. So these are some of the cool things that we can do with this. This gives me a way to, now this code is going to look daunting probably. We're going to take these things very step by step so that it doesn't look as daunting once we tackle it, because we'll talk about each line as we sort of throw it in there. But this amount of code to do this right here, what this is this is a list of all the states, right? And it's just like when you're on Facebook and you start typing and it tries to guess what it is that you're looking for, right? So this is a UI, what we call a UI stands for user interface. So we'll talk about UI. Also UX is user experience. Those are some industry terms that we throw around a lot. I am, in my day job, I'm a senior UI UX architect. That's what I do for a living. And anyway, so believe it or not, this may look overwhelming here, but to actually produce this result here, you're probably looking at about, conservatively 500 lines of code. You know what I mean? Maybe more, maybe less, depending. But to do everything that you could do it in much less, but if you wanted to do everything that this does, a lot of code. So that's one example. Here's another one. I can show a little pop-up, right? So it's like, oh, hey, here's, imagine that this were a list of emails, and I click on one, and then I say, oh, I'm gonna share this email. Well, that's a bad example, right? But whatever. I'm gonna interact with this one particular one in this row that I clicked on, because now I have this pop-up that pertains to only these ones, right? So you got simple stuff like buttons. We have cards. Not much to see there. Checkboxes. These are, we already have checkboxes, but these are just like a more visually appealing version of them. Chips. So I don't know if you've seen this kind of filtering search concept where you can say, hey, I want to, you know, search for, what was it, orange? I don't even remember what was there. Oh, but it's just, okay, right. So so one of the reasons we're not going to talk a lot about HTML and CSS is because in the industry nowadays, there are these very common use cases, these things that are collected in this sidebar right here, which are things that are frequently requested features. Like most web applications have some number of these features, right? And so there's a certain amount of HTML, CSS, and JavaScript that's required to make that magic happen. And with this is called a UI framework. And so we basically have this concept of somebody else wrote a ton of code. I use a little bit of code that sort of taps into the much larger amount of code that somebody else wrote, right? And so basically, in my day job, I have to know how to write HTML and CSS. It's really critical. But I don't need to know that necessarily in the very beginning, like if I just want to do something simple like we're going to tackle in this class, right? So at the end of the day, if you want to be very employable, your employer will expect that you know how to do that stuff, but you can also produce results without having an extremely deep understanding. Go ahead, Mike.
Do I have to know any JavaScript to learn AngularJS at all?
You definitely.
AngularJS would be the JavaScript, but
there is some amount of stuff that you could do with Angular without any JavaScript experience. But at the same time, it is a JavaScript framework, and it's much, much more powerful when you understand JavaScript. You'll run into limitations quickly if you don't have a JavaScript understanding at all. Then what will happen is you'll be able to do some stuff, but you'll hit a sort of ceiling quickly. So we're going to talk about fundamentals of JavaScript in this class because that is essential to me being able to interact with AngularJS, which we're going to use for this project, right? So, and this is called material design or Angular material. So it basically is a layer that sits on top of, so you have JavaScript, right? And then on top of that is Angular, which is an easier way to do and work with JavaScript. And then on top of that, we have this UI library, which is called Angular material. And we're going to use that to represent some of our stuff so that it doesn't look like terrible on the screen. Anyway, I've said a lot. Does anybody have questions? I want to stop.
Is this the same as using like Twitter Bootstrap?
Mm-hmm. Yep, it's the same exact thing. The difference is that, so from a technical perspective, I don't want to go too deep on that, but Twitter Bootstrap was a standard in the industry for a long time. And it still is, and if it's basically does the same kind of thing. So if you don't know what that means, don't worry. It's just the same thing basically. It's a competitor that does the same. The only difference is that Angular Material is a little bit more feature forward. So it's anticipating some of the features that are coming in browsers now and in the future. And so it's less compatible with like very old Internet Explorer, versions. But it has some really cool things that Twitter Bootstrap doesn't do because they're supporting those older browsers. So that being said, the first thing I want to do is actually, oh, go ahead.
Yeah. We compare the Angular with the jQuery.
Yep.
What's the
difference?
Yeah.
Well, some of the key features that are different include routing. So like if you look at this right here, the reason that this little, what we call a hash bang is in the URL is because this is all on the server, it's all this, right? Normally, every time I go to a different, like everything after the first slash and the .com or whatever is a different page. And so the server renders that page and serves it down the pipeline to your browser. But in this case, we're only ever on this page. But as we navigate around and you watch this URL change here, what'll happen is Angular is doing all of that. So Angular, this is a little bit of, it's Angular inside of Angular, right? So their whole thing is built on Angular as well, their website is. And so the difference in this case, one of them is routing. So I can have different sections of my application and have what appear to be URLs, but in reality they're not. But that's something that's possible with jQuery, possible with Angular, sorry, but not possible with jQuery. That's one example. Another thing is two-way data binding. So let's see, I think there's...
Does Angular touch the backend?
Nope.
It's also on the client side.
Well, jQuery does not. jQuery also does not touch the back end, but it can. And in the same way, Angular does not necessarily, but it can.
Okay.
So you can make calls to a RESTful API. Sorry for people who don't know what I'm talking about right now. You can make calls to a RESTful API and get JSON data back, and that's the typical way that a website's built with Angular. So you're not going to build a huge application without a server, but we're just not going to cover that in this class. You know what I mean? So, so two-way data binding in this case is this. There's an inherent tie between this bit and this bit. So when I change it, it automatically updates live. So that's one of the features of Angular that's kind of cool. So what that does is that allows JavaScript to watch those changes that are happening inside of this field and react to them and make changes inside of the HTML document, right? So, you know, for example, if I uploaded a photo and I had a little crop tool that I could drag around, you know, that's all JavaScript, and that's something that could be done with Angular as well. You know, so this is a real simplistic example, though. Okay, so that's that. So let's jump back to this. Do I still have that on my clipboard? Nice. Surprised. So let me see here. Before one of my coworkers messages me while I'm doing this, I'll turn that off. So the first thing I want to do is include my my Angular JavaScript. And so there are two ways that you could do this, right? One is to have it stored locally so that it's loaded from my computer, and I could create over, this is my file structure in case you're not clear on that. I could save it inside of a folder called JS and then reference it that way. For simplicity, we're just going to reference the one that's on the web. This is what's called a CDN. And a CDN is where very popular JavaScript libraries are stored in the cloud, right? So in this case, Google, per this bit here, Google is hosting this, and they probably get 10 million requests a day for this particular JavaScript file because Angular is popular, right? Also, Angular is a product of Google. In case that wasn't, in case you know, for anyone who's interested. And Google's very, very friendly to open source software development. A huge number of the tools that I use every day come from Google. So anyway, so we've got our script in there. Nothing's going to happen quite yet, right? Because now when the page loads, I still get hello world, but let's take a look at this. So if you're in Chrome and you right click, sort of peeling back the the onion here in terms of complexity, all this stuff is, so when I first started programming years ago, this is how I did it. I opened the inspect element and I saw, wow, there's all this code. I didn't know that that was there, and it turns out that everything that I'm working with every day is built on top of HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. And when I click that, I get a view of that stuff, right? So when I hover this, it says, oh, there's your H1 tag, which is hello world. And so I can see, oh, interesting, the orange means that if I go over here, where did it go? Right. So the orange bit right here is 21.44 pixels of, in this case, margin, right? So before I add CSS styles to it, every page has a certain amount of padding, or in this case, margin, sorry. So that is something that I can override. So I can actually go in here and I can say, oh, hey, let's add a style to this, and we'll say margin is 0. And you watch it change, right? So this is something, when I started, this wasn't possible. well, I guess Firebug was around maybe then, or maybe it was before Firebug that I started. But anyway, the ability to live update CSS like this is really helpful for my job. And so I basically spend all of my time between this window, this window, and this window. That's what I do all day, every day. And this is a really helpful tool set. So, you know, we'll talk about it as it becomes relevant, right? So you saw it change here, and so it kind of commented out that bit that I had added. So I'll clean that up. We'll just delete it, and then it's gone. Okay, so that being said, what I was going to show you is in the sources, so I have this tab here called sources. This will show me what's loaded. This will save you an incredible amount of headache and pain if you ever think, hey, one of the things that I did when I first started all this stuff was, hey, oh, I'm going to use Angular, or I'm going to use jQuery, right? And so then you start writing some JavaScript, and you're thinking like, hey, you know, the first thing that happened to me was, why isn't it working, right? And so this is where you can see what is loaded by your page. So one of the common problems, so one thing that can happen is you're not going to try to use Angular without ever adding this script here. That's not going to happen. But what will happen is you'll do, you know, a slip of the finger, and then you go over here, you know, and if I had JavaScript that was trying to run Angular, it doesn't work, right? So when I fixed it, you saw that it disappeared, right? So everybody saw that. So then if I fix my syntax error, now all of a sudden it's back and we're doing good. So this is a very helpful place to be. You can also see other things. We won't get too deep into this part, but if I had a server that was sending data back and forth while I was doing this stuff, even the server's transactions between my browser and the server would appear here, so I can then track and say, hey, did that data ever come down? And I can check here. So really helpful tool for that sort of thing. So anyway, so we have Angular in here, so that's a good start. Let's see, can I do, what's that? This one here? You can either do on a Mac, I don't know what it is on PC or other, but Command-Option-I is what I use because I'm a hotkey junkie. I don't like to touch the mouse. But if you, nice, nice, very good. And then if you do Inspect Element right here, you right-click, and then you do Inspect Element. That's the longhand way to get there. Most browsers will do something like that. Go ahead. Which other one? This one? Oh, this? This is just my browser. What do you mean? I don't understand your question. Sorry. Yeah, so this is just the same browser that I would open Google Chrome and start, you know, typing whatever. Yeah, yeah. No worries. No worries. All right, cool. So the thing that we have here is we have Angular, right? So let's check it. So I did that quickly before I answered a question, but the window is a JavaScript object that lives inside of every browser, and it does all kinds of stuff. Like I can do like, well, how high is my window, right? Is it, nice. What is window to outer height maybe? Ah, that's what it is, there we go. So right now the JavaScript engine, which is, this is a thing that's inherently coupled to your browser, right? JavaScript, you can turn it off if you're really paranoid and weird, which some people do. But for the most part, nobody does that. And people like me hate people who do that. But anyway, you do that? Excellent. Just to make sure that it really breaks well, right? And so anyway, so in JavaScript, JavaScript is, in programming, we have a concept called object-oriented programming, right? So object-oriented means that we create these structures, and I'm not going to get too deep yet. I'll try to like lead by example rather than go into a long dissertation about what object-oriented programming is. But you know, objects themselves, it's a way of, in this case, deeply nesting. So each time I type something here, my browser knows that there are other things available, right? So these are all the things that are native to the browser. So there's JavaScript that lives inside of your browser all the time, whether you do anything or not, right? And a lot of what we're going to do is we're going to add other JavaScript that the browser doesn't already have. But there's also a lot of cool things that you can do without that, and so that's one of them, right? So I don't want to get deep into this. Coding in raw JavaScript is not really the order of business for this class. Oh, okay. So to start off, I can say, hey, what's the height of my window? So in this case, it's 996 pixels, right? And if I change this, just to prove that that's a meaningful thing, let's get rid of that. If I change this and I do it, now I have 849. So I shrunk the window by, you know, however many pixels that is. Looks like 115 or something like that. So that being said, I can also do this, right? So when I load a JavaScript file, typically it's going to be an object that lives on the window, right? So actually, window.angular, if I enter that, I'm going to see, oh, okay, cool. There's about 500 million things that window.angular can get me. So this is all of the things that JavaScript does. So when I talk about object-oriented programming, notice right here this says object. So that's because that's JavaScript's way of treating that particular. It's a function. It's a programming sort of unit which does something. It's an object, and so it can be nested. That's why it's called object-oriented. Object-oriented programming is when at a very basic level, an explanation of it is that you have this concept of nesting, right? So inside of the $CSP, turns out there are a number of other objects inside of there, and then those objects have objects, and those objects have objects. And so in JavaScript, we call that the prototype chain. So usually things will stuff themselves inside of other things, and they just kind of snowball, just like I just showed you in this on my screen, right? So window.angular gives me access to Angular in my application. So now let's talk a little bit about how we're going to introduce that or use it in our app, right? So the first thing that any application needs, we have these things. So right now I can do, oh, that's good to hear it's working. And if you guys see, if anybody is on the Hangout and sees a question from somebody, hopefully it's helpful just for them to watch in. Obviously, it's going to be a little bit more limited, their ability to participate. But if you see a question come through there because maybe somebody is on there, let me know. So let's see. Let's do it this way. So this is called an attribute. So HTML has a concept of attributes, and attributes allow me to do certain things to everything which is the body. In this case, style, and then this particular equals, and then quotes. Everything in between this quote and this end one is what's called, in this case, CSS. So we'll visit that a little bit here and there. We talked about it with the margin bit where I took the 20 pixel margin off of the body tag, and then it got smaller, you saw on the screen. So if I save this, jump over here, let's see, what am I doing wrong? Oh, do I have a syntax error there? Interesting. Weird. Good times. Can't even do basic stuff. Let's see, why isn't that working? Style. Huh. Oh well, I'm not gonna. I don't want to spend a lot of time on it. But the point is that let's do it. Margin.
You put that style tag in the H1.
Oh, okay. Really interesting. I didn't know that I couldn't do. Oh yeah, thank you. Most basic thing, right? So I appreciate that. Yeah. So. He's exactly right. So this kind of how one, so that's a great example, right? We deal in these layers of abstraction, you know, when you're actually working in the industry, so much that this is very, very far away from me. This, what I'm showing you right now, is a very bad way to approach this, because what happens is you have all this HTML all over the place, and then you have 500 lines of code, and you can't find, you know, why is that thing red, right? So if I put this here, I guess it'll work. Right. So now there's 200 pixels around, and I can look at that and say, you can see that's the case, and then right there's your 200, right? So, and the reason I made that mistake is because we don't do this way, and it's a very bad idea to do. But I just want to demonstrate this is an HTML attribute, right? And you can do things with it. There are different elements have different things. You also have things like a radio button or a checkbox, and you can have attributes like checked or not, you know, like checked, or if it doesn't have the checked attribute, then the checkbox won't be checked. But the reason I mention that is because with Angular, we have it's technically an attribute, but it's actually what we call an Angular directive. So Angular directives, they depend upon and they use HTML attributes. And with those HTML attributes, what happens is, since Angular is loaded on this page, when the page loads, Angular will totally ignore everything that happens unless I add the ng app direct. This is called a directive in Angular. And so everything that lives inside of the place where I pin this, because I could also do something strange. This is a bad idea, right? But I could also do something like put it here, and then Angular will ignore anything that I put, you know, further down. Oh, that's annoying. Let me close that out. I'm really getting frustrated by. I normally have. Here we go. So I don't like to write these things out, so I have a thing called emit, which basically, if I write certain HTML things and then I just press tab on my keyboard, it just completes it for me, so I don't have to write all that code out. So that's a cool plugin that you can get for Sublime Text if you ever, you know, pursue this and are interested. Anyway, the content of, you know, heading 3 is completely ignored by Angular, right? So Angular won't do anything with it. So what I want to do is I want to put it on my body tag so that everything inside of my body tag is affected by the JavaScript library when it loads. So when it loads, it's going to look for, that's just a starting point, because we have a lot of other directives which we'll talk about gradually as we go through, like ng repeat is one of the most common ones. And in this case, this is just code on the screen that has no meaning whatsoever unless Angular is there, in which case Angular has a special ability to interpret that and do some magic with it, which we'll go over as we sort of walk through things here. So, so that being said, I'll add this, and then there's another component which we haven't talked about yet, but I need to have script tag. So script tags are where between these blocks is where JavaScript lives. So we're going to write JavaScript inside of the script tags. And right now I have ng app, and there's nothing in here, which is a problem. So it's not going to do anything until I put something in there. And then I can call it my app and put that in there like that. And it's still not going to do anything, because what will happen is when I go over here, it will tell me. Sometimes these errors are something that I can talk through and explain to you. In this case, it's too abstract and strange for that, so we can't really get much out of it. But basically, the reason that I have this error here is because I've tried to hook up my app, but I have not created my app, because my app has a hook inside of the HTML, but it needs to be defined and coded out inside of the JavaScript. So now so inside of script tags is where we're going to do that. So that being said, I will go ahead and cheat. I have this little, I walked myself through this so that I don't have to like code on the fly. So we'll add our bit here, and I'll talk through this as we go. So before I go further, any questions? Make sense, sort of? Cool. So in the same way, so there's remember how we did this? We did window.angular. So everything in JavaScript, when it's operating inside of the browser, it gets pinned to the window, right? So that's where it is. But the thing is, because the variable is declared in the window, that means, so I could do something weird like this. This will be fun. So in JavaScript, this is a variable. So we have these special 3 letters are very meaningful. One of the biggest things that's tough when you first start in programming is if if I switch this, if I put equals here, somebody was telling me about this recently that they had this problem, couldn't get stuff to work, right? That's gonna fail, right? So everything is very precise when you're working in programming. So if you mess something up, you put a comma where it shouldn't be, a period where it shouldn't be, it's going to totally throw you off, and it's going to cause all of your stuff to fail to work. So this is the correct syntax. Right here you use var, that means variable, space is required, and then anything goes here. So this could be, this could be Brian. In this case, it's going to be Angular. And then you have equals. This space is necessary, otherwise you're just going to have a meaningless bunch of text. You don't have to have spaces here. I just like to do that so that it's less confusing and clearer to read. But now if I go back to my application, let me get rid of my error here. Oh, no. Yeah, cool. Sometimes there's what's called a race condition in JavaScript. Explain that right now. We'll touch on it later, but I'm glad it worked. So basically, what happened was, remember how last time we did window.angular, it had all of this stuff, right? There was this huge thing, and this time it just says test, right? So in Angular, or in JavaScript, you can override things. You can say, oh, that used to be that. Now let's make it this instead. So let's do something interesting here. Let's say, for some really strange reason, I just really need to have a variable that's called Angular, right? So what I can do is I can do var temp angular equals window.angular. Well, so the window is optional. I'm not sure if I've completed my thought on that. So when I say window, if it's without, it behaves the same way, because the place that all those objects are stored in the browser is on the window. Okay, so that's implied. So if I leave it out, it's the same with or without. Okay, so if I just say, hey, let's take this and we're going to create this thing called temp angular. So I refresh. Now all that stuff that was previously on Angular is on it's on temp angular instead, and Angular still has the thing that we had before, which is it's no longer Angular, it's just test, right? So we don't do that kind of thing. There are reasons to do that. You know what I mean? So it is relevant. It's just that I'm just trying to explain. This is dynamic typing is what we're talking about. Well, no, that's not dynamic typing. It's just dynamic variable assignment. But yeah. Can you reset it back to when? Yep, sure. I can do the exact same thing. Now you can't do var more than once, or I think you can, but it'll throw a syntax error. But I can just do like angular equals temp angular, and now back to what it was. Right? So does that make sense? A little confusing, I think. Again, I'm assuming that we have 0 programming backgrounds, so I'm trying to make this as easy as we can to walk into for people who don't have that background. So should I move on? Good, good. Okay, all right, so we'll move on. So with the Angular object, to create an ng app, like we talked about before, some other programming languages have much more helpful and explanatory error messages sometimes. So anyway, we have this problem, right? We're gonna, if we do rules app, we're gonna have the same problem we did before, right? Uncaught. Where did that come from? Interesting. I'll ignore that for now because it's not critical because we're not there. But basically the problem is that I have not hooked up or created my JavaScript application. So this is just HTML attribute. This is just an HTML attribute, but when Angular's there, it tells Angular, hey, jump in the mix here. I need you to do something for me. You know what I mean? So when I create an app, I have to do angular.module. And you have to forgive me for what looks sort of complex. These are all just like before, like where we had syntax errors. You put the equal sign in the wrong place. All this stuff has to be the way it is. So the first thing is in parentheses. So we'll walk through this real slow. So if angular.module is a function, so an object is data. It's just data that's stored in a way that can be accessed later, right? It can be something like Angular equals test, or it can be something more complex than that. And in fact, it's always going to be usually something much more complex than that. If a variable like angular.module is a function, then the way that you invoke the function is to use parentheses. So this part right here, very important. We use them all the time in JavaScript, and what they do is right. So so let's back up to what I had before. So the first thing that happens inside of a function when you do the parentheses, like I show here. Oops. So if module was a very simple function, I might just pass in an argument, or these are called either arguments or parameters in programming. So we have this concept of a string, and so what I'm doing is I'm saying, hey, execute that function and pass in a value which is a string, right? And the string is rules app. So if I just do, let's do a little demo of that real quick. For people who have programming experience, sorry, you signed up for this, so it's gonna take a while before we get to the big stuff. But if I do a function called test, what this is a required in JavaScript way of declaring a function, right? There are other ways, other syntaxes for doing it, but this is one. So in here, what we're going to say is, hey, argument could be parameter as well, right? So return argument. Okay. So again, these braces, super important. They define the beginning and end of the function. If you leave them out, it's not going to work. So highly critical, right? And so if I load this up, it might work even though I have that error. Okay. So if I just do window.test, it shows me what that object is. That object in this case happens to be a function, as you can see. There we go. That would be a little bit easier to read. But let's do a little test now where we'll say, okay, window.test, and then we will pass it a simple string, and it returns that string, right? So what we're doing here is we're saying take the argument and spit it back out, right? So that's what that does. Okay, so go ahead.
Another fact for people that don't know that there's really curly braces.
Yeah.
They're the ones with little points on the sides, and also that very touch the fact that return just stops it.
Mm-hmm. Yep. That is awesome. Yeah, so return, so Mike raises a good point, which is that if I do, let me show you something here. I do stuff like this all the time in my testing. I just do console log hello, and then hello comes out, right? So if I say console log test number 2, reload the page, and then I do window test hello, it says hello. Why did it not return console log test number 2? So I put it up here. Now it does. So return is the end of the function, right? So you never want to have anything after your return. The only reason that they don't make return a sort of automatic thing is because sometimes functions will do other things, but they don't necessarily return anything, right? So that's an important concept in JavaScript or in just programming in general. So functions don't always need to return a value back to you when you call them. You know, it might just say, hey, let's just take a look at it, right? Window.angular equals test. So, and then we will I'll remove this just because it's confusing and unnecessary now. So now if I have Angular, where did I, interesting. How did I lose that?
We will not see it inside the function. Will we?
What's that?
We will not see it inside the function.
Well, the function hasn't been invoked, so I'm not actually sure why. Why is there a error? Let's see. I don't know if this will fix it. I have this live debugging, nothing like that. No idea why. Oh, I guess that's because of this, huh? No. Strange. No idea why that is doing that. I must have botched my script tag here. Am I connected to the internet? Okay, I am. That would have explained it. In any case, we'll just move along because I don't feel like wasting your time. So anyway, if I go back to this, does it work? No, Angular is not defined. So let's see. I see. Nope, still don't see. Anybody who is a programmer, let me know if you see anything. It's pretty simple, and I have no idea why we got tripped up so early here. What's that? You got anything? How do we end up here so quickly? This is a shame. Nope. This is fun. I wonder if I delete this guy, what'll happen? Nope. Is the CDN down? That would be awesome.
Delete some characters out of the script. So.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it'll of course work if I do that, but it's not loading Angular. So hold on, I have a different thing I want to try, which is see if I can access this JavaScript file. Aha. Awesome. I ran out of Wi-Fi access. So do I have to now do this every however many minutes? Oh yeah, that would be awesome. I don't remember where to get my MAC address. Do you know it? Where? I'll just. Oh, I can't Google how to get my MAC address.
Are you a guest?
Just bring up Bash
Yeah.
Live config.
Which one are you looking for?
Type it in more so we have a whole screen.
They've been what?
You should be having a dead address or something. What were you on? You know what interface you were on?
I have no clue.
This guy up here. Here's where you were probably. So you're 80.
So glad we have a faculty representative here.
E65007.
What's that?
For Wi-Fi.
That's what he needs. That's what he needs.
Yeah, yeah. So I can email this to you. Oh no, I can't email it to you.
Oh, 80.
This is terrible.
Is it for Wi-Fi?
Yeah, it's for Wi-Fi. Because
I have a UD account if you want to log in.
should I have somebody log me in and then email this to you or something?
No.
Okay. Okay.
Just
Got
go register.
Sweet. Good times. So, any questions while we're getting this figured out? No questions. No.
The browser console you're going to use.
Yep. This guy? Yeah, so if I'm here and I hit escape, it's gone.
Right.
But I can, I think I just do escape, and that brings it up. I don't remember the other method. I use escape. So when I have this open and I hit escape, it opens the browser console.
No, I was just wondering, I guess maybe there's a difference in the Windows version.
I don't know. You can't just enter it? Are you in Google? Are you in Chrome?
No, that might be.
That's the reason.
Okay.
Yeah.
I mean,
When-
Chrome, but
Yeah. Google Chrome is sort of far and away the best way to do this kind of stuff. The tooling that I get that I'm showing here is far more advanced with Google Chrome than it is with any other browser. So I recommend it. So, but yeah, that's how you get this console, this command prompt, you know what I mean? So, yeah, sure. This one?
80 E6 50 07 08 80
82 E6.
Yep.
80 E6 50 07 08 80.
I think,
It's FE 80, 82.
yeah, FE,
Oh, okay, sorry. FE.
FE80. And then,
It's only 60. No, that's FE's your link local. It's only 6 bytes long.
okay.
You'll be up for the next 5 weeks
Yeah,
because you're registered as me.
all right.
07 08 80. So this is an IPv6 address.
Okay, yeah.
This is your IPv4 address.
Yep.
And we don't have 6 here. So
Okay.
it's a link local address. And this is your Ethernet MAC address right
Okay,
here.
great.
48 bits, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6,
Okay,
6 bytes.
awesome. Good stuff. Thank you.
Hey, Brian, if you're curious, when you're writing a function,
Mhm.
it has parameters.
Yep.
Like the things you write it with are parameters, and when you call a function, it has an argument.
Okay.
So a function has parameters.
Okay, good. Good.
So disconnect your router.
Okay, awesome.
Shannon's very different from Peter.
No, I haven't tried yet. No, I'm good now. Good to go. Cool, okay, so let's pick up where we left off. So what was the thing we were doing before that all blew up on us? This guy, right? I think I might have run over it in my undo history here. It's a shame. What was I doing with that when I created the test function? Oh, so what I was gonna, that's right. So you don't have to have a return value in a function, right? So what can happen is, it's not a word, I don't think, but I figured it sounds good. So right now, if I do window.angular, I get what I expect. But if I do window.test, or sorry, if I invoke the function, and then I do window.angular, I overrode it, right? So there's one really dirty, quick example of how a function doesn't always have to return a value. Doesn't always have to spit something back out when you call a function. It can just do other sort of, maybe in this case, it's a sneaky behind the scenes thing that it's doing. So anyway, so that's that. So let's get back to the train that we were on before. So in this example, I'm declaring a module. So it's a little confusing. One could argue that maybe they should have called this like Angular app so that it ties directly to doing, you know, ng app rules app, right? One could argue that, but that's not the case. In any case, you do module, and what happens is the first argument, or is a parameter. Okay, I'll memorize it and then forget it, and then it'll be good. So the first argument is a string, which is rules app. So again, all these things are magical and important. So like the single quotes on the other side right there, they make it a string, right? So if I just wrote rules app, and what I'm actually doing is I'm passing a variable that's not defined into the function. So it'll throw an error. So that's why we have to do our single quotes around it. So that means that it's going to know that this value is just a series of letters or numbers. Well, no, letters, right? That are, if I put a number in, then it's interpreted as if it were a letter. I don't want to go too deep on stuff that's confusing, but anyway, you pass in a series of letters and or numbers or symbols or whatever, and then that is interpreted literally rather than the parser trying to, you know, assume it's a variable that has meaning or something like that. So that's a little weird because sometimes with JavaScript libraries, you would pass some kind of function or an object in when you do that. But in this case, this is how Angular does things. So the first argument is a string, which has to match up with a ng app somewhere in your document, right? So this whole bit here, when I look at all of this, this is called the DOM. So that stands for Document Object Model. And the reason it's called a Document Object Model in programming, just like we talked about before, nesting has special meaning, and we call this sort of stuffing of things inside of things, we call that the object model. That's a overly simplistic way of explaining it, right? So the reason this is called the document object model is because in the same way, you see how head is highlighted at the top and bottom, this is this concept of nesting things inside of things, right? So I can keep going really far down. I can just do div inside of div, inside of div, inside of div. And at the end of this, our code will look like this. But we're going to try to tackle that complexity in a slow way so that it's easily digestible. So that being said, we're going to look for rules app. And inside of the rules app, we're going to set up a, so I can do this, right? Like this. Now what I've done is, if I go in here, there's no error. So if I get rid of this, now there's an error, right? So that proves that what we did had an effect, right? So we just said, hey, rules app, you know, refresh, now it exists. So no more error from the browser. So that's great. But we want to do something with it because right now it's not doing anything for us. So the next step is we want to, Angular has a concept in programming, there is a philosophy called Model View Controller. So it's also called MVC. And MVC means that you separate your data. So like some of the stuff that we talked about here, like window.angular, technically speaking, that's data. It's an object, right? So, but there's data that's more like, you know, when you log into Facebook and it says your username and your email address and, you know, your first and last name and all that stuff. That's data, right? So we call that the data model. So in MVC, model stands for that data model, right? The M stands for that data model. The V stands for view. So this right here is our view. View is anything that's presentational. Anything that the user sees and impacts what they're looking at is called the view. That's a simple way of understanding it. And then the controller is what we're about to create. So a controller gives me a context to execute logic or special operations. And so inside of that logic, I can do different things. So some of the stuff that we did here before, you know, when we were creating our functions, like, you know, var test equals function, you know, and then we're doing what we did before, right? This stuff would often be nested inside of a controller. And so if I do, I'll show you this just because this is relevant because we're going to create a controller. That's one of the first things we're going to want to do. And so if I set this up here and I say console.log I from test, and then I call test. I got to get rid of this guy. Do that. Okay, so what do we have? Hi from test. Okay, cool. So, so with hi from test, what we can do is that shows us that the function is definitely being called. But let's go a step further, and what we'll do is we'll create a function inside of it. And so we'll say test.testLevel2 equals function. And we'll do the same that we did before, which is message, and we'll say return message. Okay. So now, when I reload, I get hi from test. Okay, cool. Test has been called. And then, what did I call that? Test. Okay, so there's my function, right? And I can do this. So pay special attention to that character right there, right? Because this is what we call in JavaScript dot notation. So dot notation says that I can stuff things inside of other things at a sort of, if I do it with Angular, right? Window.angular dot, you know, what's a good bind to string, you know, so you can keep going with these things. Like I showed you how they sort of chain really deep, you know. So in my example function test with test level 2, you know, here's the function, right? And I can call that just like this, and I get that back. Okay, so from a programming perspective, these things, they scale to infinity in terms of complexity. And in terms of concept, this is a really simple way of understanding. We could call test a controller in this example, right? Because a controller is kind of like a container for many other functions, right? So the controller is itself a function, and it contains many other functions. That's one way to think of it. You sound like you have some thoughts on it. Okay. Okay, cool. I wasn't sure. I mean, you corrected me on something before. I wasn't sure if I'm boring you or what. So what we're going to do is we're going to create a controller. And what that the purpose of this is just organization, right? So I have one section of my app that's like to-dos, and another section of my app that's like list of users. And so I group those into related functionality. And that's how I scale a very large application. That's what I do in my day-to-day job. You know what I mean? I work in that way. So So if I go back to this now that we understand, it's a little bit different because I presented a more simple version of it to you. Angular has a special idea about what a controller is there. So what happens is Angular will interpret it, and it will create a controller much like the one I just gave you, except it gives you things for free that you'll commonly want to do. You know what I mean? Things that are very typical operations when you're building a web application. So in an Angular controller, let's see. Jump over here. Okay. Sources. Does that need to be in an external file? Ugh. It's weird. Good times. Oh, here. That's where it is. Okay. Oh, it's not called. So we'll put our ng app back, right? Because we took that out. So we have rules app. Okay, so that's my first problem. But now I need a place to use my controller, right? So in the same way that we have app, this has to live inside of an app for it to work. But if you are inside of that app and you've done something like this to create a controller, then I can do this much the same way, and I can say search control, right? So now inside of this, when it's loaded, remember how before we had to do tests like this? We had to say, hey, call that function. You know, hey, execute that function. The difference is Angular does that for free for me. So if I start, what happens is this is a function, and I'll try my best to explain it to you, but it's a little confusing. But this is a function. Why is it being called? It doesn't make sense, right? Because I never actually did this. I never did search control. I never did that, but yet when I load the page, I find that actually, oh, it's being called, right? So if I step forward, you see hello from search control, right? So that means that that's called. This is part of what Angular does for free that makes programming a little more accessible for people who don't have a programming background. You know what I mean? So, so we don't need to call search control directly. Angular does that for us for free just because I did this. If I do this, it says, hey, invoke the search control function, create one, and then do whatever. In this case, we're just doing console.log, which just logs out search control to the screen. So let's see. I got to get rid of my breakpoints. Okay. So we now have a controller, and that's cool because now we could do, we can console.log, hey, what's 4 plus 7, and then we refresh, and oh, okay, it's 11. Almost forgot. But this is what we do, right? We do logic that that it gets us things, right? So what we want to do next is, let me double check my notes about where I want to go from here. Okay, nice. So the next thing that I want to do is I'm going to create, so I'm going to do some other stuff. Remember how we looked at Angular material before? So right now I have this beautiful Hello World app that looks a little boring. So we'll spice it up a little bit. And in doing so, what we'll do is we'll add Angular material as our UI framework. So that's going to give us some more pleasing aesthetics. It's a little confusing because it actually has, I think, 4 parts, right? So I actually need to include many scripts. So we had this script that got us Angular, right? But this time for Angular material, there's actually 4 different components to it. So I'm going to include all those just by copying them out of here. And let's see. Go ahead, Zach.
I'm really going here, but so why do we see that hello from search control like in the bottom console, but not on
Not on the actual page. Good question. Yeah, so this has to do with, this actually has to do with client side versus, so like I know you have some programming experience like Python and that sort of thing, right? So, you know, in Python, it's going to execute inside of some container, right? And so if I have like a terminal open, it'll show in the terminal, it'll log out like hello world. But that's not true for this because we're in the client side, we're in the browser. So if I have not specifically told it to do something, it's not going to show up on the screen unless I have a way of saying something like, you know, search control, you know, and then also I'm returning it. So I'm returning it as a value. And so when I return it as a value, that's not the same as putting it in the DOM, right? So Angular is going to give us some really cool tools to do that in a way that feels like it will kind of bypass that confusion that you have right now. You know what I mean? So normally I can do, so let me show you how that would be done. That's a good question. Let's start at the basics, right? Window dot, I think it's window right. I don't even remember. All these archaic methods I don't even use. Window right, it's document right, yeah, okay. So let's rewind that, right? So you can see actually now a different font, right? So it's still pretty boring, but it's getting prettier because we added that other stuff. But what I can do is something a little bit less obvious, where I just say, hey. So what happened is in JavaScript, to access the visual piece, you have to write to the DOM, right? So when I do document.write, this representation that you see here, called the document object model, when I do document.write, it overwrites whatever is there. There are other methods which I'm not going to get into because this is sort of this is the core of JavaScript, and it's great to understand the core, but that's not really my focus for this. I want to show you how to do something that's meaningful, right? So one of the things we're going to cover as we get into it is Angular will do document write behind the scenes for me, but it'll do it in a much more, it's not just going to overwrite my whole page. It's going to put it in the right place. It's going to put the right values in the right place. It's going to only write stuff that I want to or don't want to, you know, so don't worry if that sounds confusing. The whole point is it's a free thing that we get just for using a framework. You know what I mean? So we don't have to worry about that. But that's a great question. So like if I did, so I could just do it in here, right? Just for the fun of it, you know. Now what'll happen is it will happen when it loads, it'll say hello world. But because JavaScript renders really fast, your eye won't see it. All you'll see is I was changed, okay? And you can tell that it was changed also because it's missing a bunch of other stuff that I have declared in here, right? See, it's all gone now. Okay, so that function is automatically invoked because of this. So the next thing I wanted to do was jump over to material, Angular material. Before I do that, any questions so far? Trying to do my best to show something meaningful and not explain all the underlying theory, but at the same time, try to make it so that it's understandable and digestible. So, cool. So the next thing that we're going to do, so now we have, if I get rid of that bit that I had before, again, did I not save that? I guess I didn't save that. There we go. All right, so search controls down here. Cool. So I have hello world, and I have a Angular application, and I have a controller that's being instantiated or created when the document loads. So the next thing I want to do is take a look at creating, I'm going to just steal my simple UI that I had created here. Let's see here. So from here, change the title, right? And so now we're going to have rules search. That'll be the new thing. And then from here, we jump over to this. So let's leave something in here so that I know that the search control is starting. This is a way of just doing this, what I call like a sanity check. So if something ever goes wrong, let's say I slip of the finger, you know, and I delete the L, it stops working and it's just quiet. You know, it just doesn't work and I don't know why. So sometimes when I'm developing something, I have like something like this, which is a sanity check, which just says, hey, as long as I see, you know, hello from search control, you know, then I know it's still working. I didn't break it. So if I refresh, I guess I got rid of, yeah, right. So, so now I have an error, right? Because I have an error, a syntax error here, and I'm missing my L, and it's trying to create a controller that does not exist. So if I click this, Angular is pretty cool about this. It actually gives you links to the documentation inside of here. So I can click this URL, and it'll take me over, and it'll try to help me figure out what's wrong. Again, not the best or most helpful at all times, but it's better than nothing, right? So, Mike. Yeah.
Just to add to your thing, always on the right, you're also going to find like what's the line of code.
Yeah.
For anyone who doesn't know.
Yep.
If you see there's an error and it'll say, I can't actually see what line it's on, but it might say like line 19.
Yeah.
And so many characters in.
In this case, it's line 11,655. Yep. That's a good point. I appreciate that. It's good stuff. Cool. So fix our controller so it's not broken, and then we refresh. Hello from search control. So now, as long as I'm tinkering with this, I'll always have that there to remind me that, hey, it's working. The function is actually called and created and executed. All right. So the next thing I want to do is I'm going to start off by getting a dump of, let's see. I'm going to add, okay, this is a real simple one, nothing fancy here, but I'm just going to add a little UI element. So remember we talked before about how these tags have meaning. So these, as this is an HTML element, right? One of the things Angular Material does is it creates new HTML elements that don't exist. These are not part of the official W3C spec. So W3C is the committee that oversees the web and the standards that drive it. All these, you know, rules for how things are nested and stuff like that. Those are determined and debated within the W3C, and then they release different versions of new version of JavaScript. HTML5 was an upgrade from HTML4. If anybody's ever heard those references, you know. So one of the things in HTML5 is the ability to create custom. So you can actually define in JavaScript your own elements that are not even really elements. So I could say, you know, Brian's cool element, and it's now an element that I can use, and it's valid because I use JavaScript to create it, right? So, well, and you can do it even without using JavaScript. You can just put it in there, just like MD toolbar, you just drop in there. So these have special meaning. So Angular Material adds a new layer of complexity whereby it looks for these special things, these special elements that Angular Material has, and it does things to them. It hooks them up with logic, JavaScript logic. It you know, watches to see if they change, and it will trigger some other thing, like the, you know, this thing over here changes when that thing changes, and you know, things that literally rely on thousands of lines of code, but you just get it for free because you're using it and you're just tapping into something that's much sort of the iceberg or whatever, you know, below the surface, the glacier below the surface. So if I have a toolbar and I refresh now, I have a toolbar, right? So, you know, like when you go to Google Plus, because I use Google Plus because this is the same design pattern that Google uses for those products, like, you know, YouTube and Google Plus and stuff like that. So they, in the industry, we call that dog fooding, where they actually use their own products, right? So they build their product with their product. You know, so Angular Material is a library that they built, and they build their own products with it, right? So now I have this. Now I have a little bit of a separation. It's like the header of my application, right? And that's all just magic, right? So like if I change this to a div, which is a normal, very standard HTML element, which is used all the time, and I refresh, then, you know, nothing, right? So it's all tied to that stuff. So that's that. Let's take a look at what was my next step I wanted to cover. Okay. So now I am going to, now we talked about what a nerd I am, and I like to play role-playing games. So this is a bunch of rules that is part of the thing, right? So let's talk about this a little bit. So if I have a, let me do, so var array, or test array we'll call it, so that we don't have a namespace clash. So if I do the square brackets, that is an array. So the purpose of an array is that you separate things inside of it with commas. And what that means is when I log out, I'll do it real quick here. Why is that not working? Okay, anyway. It's annoying. Too many keys. So if you look here, you'll see 479, right? So this is a list. You know, it's a list of things. And that's the purpose of arrays, is they create lists. But in my case, we're going to skip right past the basics because I need to for what I want to do, which is that you can also create an array of objects. So what I will do is, let's just restart that. That's not worth it. Ooh. Give me a second to type this out. So the comma is critical. So right here we have our comma. This separates two different array elements. So just like I talked about before, object-oriented programming means that, you know, we have this ability to sort of take complexity and deeply nest things, right? So in this case, let's do it this way, actually. About 2-1, or I can't do that, can I? I'll cheat. So what I've done here, so let's log that out. Now we get into what we looked at before. See the nesting? So I have inside of it, I have two objects in my array. And so this is a very, very common practice when you're doing complex work, because sometimes I say, hey, you know, I would do the same thing with a list of users, right? So if I took the 30 or 20 people that are in this room, right, and I had an array of all of you guys, I would have first name, last name, email address, and username, right? And those would be in place of this. So it would be, you know, first name is Brian, right? And I won't go through and do all of it, but you can get the idea, right? So that would allow me to then go through and group that data in a way that I can later access it. And this is just a standard that's established in JavaScript. So Angular depends on this stuff. So what we're going to do is we'll take a look at how Angular uses that kind of structure and makes it something that's really helpful for organizing your code, right? So like I said before, I have this list of powers, I'm going to call them, right? And so each one has many different attributes. So there's the name of it, there's certain tags, And so you see right here, here's my curly brace, here's my square bracket. So powers is an array, right? And this is one object. And I have a special thing in my IDE to help me find it. If you notice, I don't know if you can see, this is highlighted right here, right? You can see right here on the screen, you can see here, that shows me the beginning and end of my, what we call scope, you know? So I have this, right? And so inside of it, there are a number of attributes. So name is an attribute, tags is an attribute, you know, power is an attribute, whatever. So I'm going to save this into a directory inside of my thing here called. So
JSON format?
it is JSON. That's exactly right. What's that?
How exciting.
I'm glad you feel that way.
I use it.
You like JSON?
I sent them around places.
You what?
Sent them places.
You send them places. I do. I use JSON all day, every day. So I love JSON. In any case, so what I've done now is I've saved this file over here in my JavaScript folder. So just like I said before, we can load something from HTTP, or in this case, we're going to load something from local. So I'm going to load my assets folder, and then inside of the assets folder is a folder called JS, stands for JavaScript. And then I have a file called powers.js. And now what I'm going to do is when this loads up, I'm going to do powers. This might not work, but we'll find out in a second. It did work. Cool. So remember how we said everything gets implicitly applied, sort of stuffed on the window, right? So I'm just doing window.powers. So if I go in here to my console and I do window, and then I do .powers, there it is. You can see it's attempting to autocomplete because it knows about it, right? So I can log it out, and there's my powers stuff. So there's a lot more to be said about it, and I'll keep going. But any questions? Anybody? No takers. I feel like somebody must be confused. Go ahead.
So that list of information.
Yeah.
Basically, the HTML document is pulling out of that.
Exactly. Yeah, so when I reference it this way, one thing we covered earlier was that when I load this up, I never actually did anything to get Angular in the global objects, in the global scope, but when I do window.angular, it's there. I never did it inside of this particular code. That's because in the same way that this pins the powers attribute to the window, the script for Angular, which I'm loading from externally, you know, from the URL on the internet, it does the same kind of hookup or wire up that happens. So Angular, by loading this, is automatically available on the window. In the same way, powers.js pins its attribute to the window for me to later use. So exactly. So even though I never actually declared powers in here, I can reference it this way and get it. You know what I mean? Now, if let's see if I can mess this up on purpose. I'm not sure if it'll work. It might still work even though I don't want it to. Yeah, I thought that would happen. You can have race conditions in JavaScript whereby a script takes a certain amount of time to load, and by the time the execution happens, the loading isn't complete. And then it'll say, hey, window.angular undefined, right? That's a common problem. But I'm trying to, you know, there's a lot of complexity I'm giving you guys, and I'm just doing my best to keep it from being too much at first. Yeah?
You always have to upload at the very beginning, or can you import for it functionally?
I don't quite understand the question.
Like you're importing that assets.
Mhm. Yeah.
Can you just import it for it functionally?
Yes. Okay. Is there a way to use JavaScript to load something external? The answer to that question is yes. We call that Ajax. So Ajax is the concept of, normally there's all this, just these documents and the static stuff that like lives on the server and it gets pushed down to you. But in the case of Ajax, it gets pushed down to you, and then your browser can make a request. It's the equivalent of visiting a new web page, except different, whereby, you know, Ajax is saying, hey, we're not going to go to the URL of this, but tell me what the data is at this source, and then it comes back in an Ajax response. You know, so if I do window dot, okay, yeah. So Angular has its own way of doing it, but at the very base level, it uses this function. So XML HTTP request is a way of getting external data and then pulling it back in from JavaScript. So I could say set timeout, which causes something to happen later. And I could say 10 seconds after it loads, go and get this script and tell me what it is. So, you know, that's something that we could do. So does that answer your question? I think you meant something else.
I guess I'll find out later.
Well, yeah, I mean, I want to make sure you understand. So what your question's a little different then. So what are you looking to do? Okay, sure. Yeah, no problem. Okay, cool. We'll you know, let me know if it becomes more clear what it is that's the missing link or whatever, and you know, we'll follow up. Cool. So I have these powers now. So I have to do something with these powers. What's that? That's right. Comes great responsibility. So one of the things that I can do in here, I'm not going to go deep on this, but a common problem in JavaScript is something called execution context. So execution context means in JavaScript, like if I have PHP that's living on a server somewhere and it's processing a web page, Facebook's PHP, right? So every time you hit a Facebook URL, it does something on the server and then it responds and sends you stuff back. So the problem is with JavaScript, it's not all run in this same sort of like, it's in certain ways less organized. And so what happens is the execution context of everything is window. So everything's happening inside of the window. You remember how we talked about how things can be nested? So at the base level, everything operates and does its magic inside of the window, and we call that the scope. So the window is a certain scope, you know what I mean? And so we're operating inside of that scope, and what happens is with JavaScript, sometimes your example is actually a great follow-up for that, because what happens is if I send data up and I send an XML HTTP request and I get back data, sometimes it'll be returned at in a sort of lazy or asynchronous way. And then what happens is it's no longer inside of the thing that you thought it was before. So like if I'm inside of test.test level 2, you remember that from before? If I'm inside of there and I make an XML HTTP request, when it comes back, it's not necessarily going to be inside of there. Now this is a problem that's been solved, right? So I don't have to write code, like I don't spend all my time writing 100 lines of code to solve this problem. Somebody else figured out a trick to do it, and then I just like I do Angular.module rules app, which depends on 12,000 lines of code to do its magic, I'm doing the same with that, right? So scope is a cool thing because scope helps in Angular applications to normalize execution context. It makes it a little bit more predictable where you are. So you're always at window, but what can happen is if I have two different applications and they both have the same name, then they can overwrite each other and they can run into each other. So that's where the nesting stuff comes in handy. We organize and we group things that way to prevent those kind of conflicts. And so scope is a way of organizing things and sort of collecting them in a container that we can assume we're in this container. Because my examples up until now show use of window, but that's a terrible way to architect an application. It's one of the biggest no-nos in JavaScript is, don't do everything on the window, because then somebody else comes along and write something out. I got 12,000 lines of code. I have this huge application, and I got 5 people that created a thing called messages. You know what I mean? And there's like, which kind of message and all that kind of stuff. So organizing your code helps to, so this object-oriented structure helps to prevent that sort of thing. So scope is an Angular injectable. So when I create a controller, Angular has things like, remember how we talked about XML HTTP requests just a second? Well, Angular has its own version of that called $HTTP. So I can make an external request using the $HTTP module, and this is all part of that 12,000 lines of magic that's happening below the surface that you never see. And so I can, for free, say, hey, give me the $HTTP module. I want to get a script from somewhere else, or I want to touch a database somewhere and get data back and say, hey, let's put that on the screen. So that's something where like maybe we'll get there in this course. I don't know, you know, to an API or something like that. But I'm thinking not. So anyway, scope is a place where one of the things that's magical about scope is that anything that's inside of the search controller has access to scope without by using templates, right? So watch this. So by doing double curly braces and putting powers in there, right now it's not going to work. I'll show you. Well, it didn't do anything, right? It just failed silently. Hold on a second. Let me see. Give me 1 second. I think I might be hiding it behind that little little toolbar. I think it's the powers bit is hidden behind there. No? Annoying. Okay, I get it. The reason that just happened, and I didn't understand it at first, is because the double curly braces is going to look for a variable attached to the scope. But since that doesn't exist, Angular sees the curly braces. It attempts to figure out what to do with them. It fails to find the powers object, and it just prints nothing on the screen, right? So let's fix that. So we have powers at window.powers. So now in here, this function, when search control is created, $scope is a parameter that's passed in, right? And so, or it's an argument that's passed in. And so when it's instantiated and when this search controller is created, it gets $scope inside of it, nested inside of it, right? So what I can do is I can do scope.powers equals window.powers, because we've loaded it and it's on the window, right? And now I'm going to get this ton of garbage that is not as bad as it seems, because that's what we want, right? We want to get data in there, so let's make it meaningful now. So now we have all that stuff printed out on the screen. So your question before, like document.write, how do I do all that stuff? You don't have to with Angular. It does all of it for you. I know how to do it, but if I were to do that myself, nobody would pay me to develop a web application in JavaScript, because it would take me, forever to do everything. I would be constantly reinventing the wheel, and instead this is something that we deal in abstractions. It's good to understand the principles, and my goal is that you guys would also get some idea or some taste of those principles, so you can then go and research that on your own and learn more on your own. So we're going to use a really cool directive now. So we've got one directive, which is rules, which ng-app. We have another one, which is ng-controller. And now we're going to use another one called ng-repeat. So with ng-repeat, Okay. So ng repeat will take a string, which is a scope variable, and it will do magic with it and make it accessible to you. So in here, so we have this property in powers called name, right? And so I will attempt before your very eyes to print name of the power so that it's organized, right? Because right now we have this dump of garbage that's not useful, right? So, oops, it's at the wrong place. I have some problem with my HTML. But anyway, there it is, right? That's the start. So let's talk about what happened here. So this adds some padding around each item. So that's why they're separate, a little bit separate from each other here, right? This tells it to be a list item, which is not behaving like one as I would expect yet. So I have something that's broken. Actually, let me cheat and look ahead. I remember having this problem and then realizing that I had something wrong. Okay, MD class list, MD list item, okay. And then it's list item text, okay, div list. Okay, so one of the learning curves behind this stuff is, you know, there's really specific structures behind how a UI framework wants you to structure your HTML so that it works correctly. So like right there, I don't know if this will work, I hope so. Let's double check. Yeah, okay, it's a start. It expect, you know, when I go to, so what are we looking at? Like, why am I doing this? Let's go here, back to our, and frequently check your documentation when you're using a UI, like JavaScript framework or UI framework. Look, read the manual, you know what I mean? Like if it's not working, check it and see why. So here's an example of them just creating a list of, you know, like a message list or something, right? So I'm just trying to use the same stuff. I can peel this back and look at their code here. And so my code should mimic theirs. Now the problem is that theirs is more complex than mine is right now. So some of this code is unnecessary. So that's one problem. And then what is the other thing that is wrong with my setup that makes it not work? I think I might be missing, yeah, there it is, layout column. So Angular material also has this thing called layout. And what it does is it allows me to create things side by side, you know? So I put a certain attribute on these guys, flex, and then I put them next to each other, and it will just take however many there are and it'll stuff them all next to each other. So if there are 4, it's automatically 4 wide. If there are 5, it's 5 wide. This uses HTML and CSS to accomplish this. So another one of those, there's this glacier beneath the surface. There's tons of stuff going on there. We won't talk about it all. Good.
You still want to, I mean, obviously, just in case the Google API drops, you still want to put all this in CSS, or at least have this, like, some sort of framework or skeleton of CSS, but use more of the meatier bits with AngularJS. Like
there's
I don't want to just forego CSS, just do all this in AngularJS or Angular.
No, you're
God, the API never drops.
Yeah, that's a good question. To be honest with you, the support might end, but that's not the same as it being taken down. It'll probably never be taken down, and also you don't.
I don't mean taken down. I mean along the lines of if anyone in here tries to access your site and their computer can't talk to the Google API library, what is your site going to something look like without the Angular?
Well, it doesn't work at all. But if I'm concerned about that, then just like right now, I'm referencing an external script that pulls it from the Google server, like you said. I can make that local just like I made powers.js local. it will live forever and ever and ever on whatever server I put it on. So that's not really the only concern is support and end of life of support, right? So it's a good example because things are fast moving in the industry, which is one of the things that makes it fun and also challenging, because in fact, we are learning an outdated technology as we speak, because they've already released Angular 2, and Angular 2 is in the software engineering community, people are up in arms because we have thousands and thousands and thousands of applications and lines of code, millions of lines of code, all written in AngularJS throughout the industry. And the path to change from Angular 1 to Angular 2 is not straightforward, which means that development teams are literally looking at hundreds or thousands or whatever of hours to move that over, potentially. Depends on the size of your application, right? But in any case, this happens all the time. But so interestingly, in my day job, we are using Angular. I code in Angular every day, and one of the things that we've done is they've released a new version of JavaScript. So newer web browsers will have what's called ECMAScript 6. It's the newest version of JavaScript, and it has a lot of language features that are borrowed from languages like Java and Python. Some of the more advanced features, which JavaScript has always been thought of as a lesser programming language because it lacked, but it's getting those new language features, and Angular 2 depends heavily on them. So a lot of the stuff that they've done with Angular 1 is to get around the lack of language features and code structure stuff that is now available in JavaScript, right? So in my day job, we're building an Angular application with Angular 1, but we have a special way of using ECMAScript 6. So some of the Angular 1 features, like for example, as we speak, I'm showing you a controller, and that's going away in Angular 2 because it's very similar to ECMAScript 6 class. And so in my day job, I write classes in ECMAScript 6, and I don't even use ng controller, right? So I use it in the templated way. We do still use it here like this, but the actual definition does not look like this. It doesn't use Angular to define it. It just uses raw JavaScript. So, so things move fast, they break. That's just part of the industry. That's why we have jobs, So, but yeah, you're not going to actually just have it drop out from the bottom. Like if you reference the external script, maybe in 7 years, Google will take down Angular 1 and your site will stop working. But if you're worried about that, then just put it on the server and then it'll never stop working. So it's an interesting question. Does that, I don't know if that helps anybody, hopefully. So where were we? Okay. So we have this problem with layout row. Did I get that fixed? I don't think so. So this is a little bit funny. In HTML, we have this concept of blocks. Things are like blocks, and you tell blocks to be next to each other or to float to the right of one or to the bottom, all kinds of stuff that has to do with developing like a layout, right? So Angular Material has its own ideas about how that can be handled, and so one of them is this, the idea of using a layout column. So I still have it broken here. Give me a second. Where is it broken? Let's see. Well, we'll just ignore it for now. It'll be pretty and I'll fix it later and then we'll all be happy, but for now it works, right? So it has a list of these different items, and there are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Okay, so there you have it. So that's a start. So to be clear, let's make sure that we explain this. What's happening here is ng repeat does this. It says the first thing is a list element. So like if you have an array, it's an object inside of that array, right? So what it does is it says, okay, powers is my array, right? And so the power word is inside of here. I'm going to repeat this whole block right here as many times as there are the number of array elements. So in this case, I forget how many I have here. There's quite a number. I think some are even off the screen here because I feel like this is wrong and it's just displaying incorrectly. I have, yeah, I mean, at least 20 or something here, right? So there's like 20 of these guys. And so for every one of those 20 items in the array, it gets the ability to be referenced by this one, the one that's first. So it's power in powers, right? And so each time I do that, I can do power, and that would just show me, like I showed you before, this dump of data. But I can also do .name because the attribute here, .name, right? And so then I'm getting this value, you know? So then I get that. And I just noticed, I heard people rustling around. I just noticed it's 8:34. So I don't have any, particular spot to stop, so that's as good as any. So anybody have, you can stay if you have questions. Otherwise, this is 5 weeks. I'm going to do this 2 hours every week, except for 1 week, which is the 17th or something like May 15th. Okay.
I shared files.
What's that?
I shared files.
Yeah, the files are all on GitHub. So if you want to look at, if you need to write it down, it's github.com/myname, which is Brian Feaster /rules search app, I think. And it's on the Google. I'll post it on like the Facebook event or something like that so that you guys can find it easily. But yeah, all the code's there and you can browse it. You can sneak peek at where we're going to go with it in the future. Cool.
I just wanted to ask a quick question.
Sure.
I saw you were using Shalom. Is there like a specific way to set up a new HTML project, or just type in, like you just type in?
I like to use this thing called Emmet. So like Emmet does my auto completion for me. So if I save, hold on a second. If I save this, if I save this as an HTML document, then Emmet knows it's HTML, and it will like autocomplete things for me.
So for example, you type in HTML, you like slash or something.
You just hit tab on your keyboard, and then it does the rest. You're welcome.
And is that traditional Sublime
Is that?
you add
It's you do Command-Shift-P, install package,
okay.
and you can find MEMMET. Yeah, you're welcome.
Copy this, copy this, paste this.
Yeah. Oh, you're welcome. Happy to help. Sure, yeah, we could do that.
Hold on, let's